I started the night with a countdown, 47 minutes to clear the last carts before the system flagged my shift. The number sat in the corner of the terminal screen like a quiet threat, ticking down in red as I wheeled the first trolley between the shelves. You scan a tag. You match a barcode. You confirm that nobody has claimed the bag in 90 days, and then you take it off the shelf and send it towards auction or recycling. The database tells you when something is finished with you. In the basement, there were no windows, just the hum of fluorescent tubes and the constant buzz of the scanners. Metal stairs rattled somewhere above whenever somebody crossed between platforms. I had worked the late shift for 3 years, long enough that my hands moved without thinking, while my mind wandered elsewhere. Kareem did not have that problem yet. He ran the second trolley a few meters behind me, sneakers squeaking on the painted floor, scanning more loudly than necessary. "Stop doing that," I said. "You're confusing my sense of accomplishment," he laughed. Let the scanner hang from its strap and pushed the trolley up alongside mine. "You know what I heard upstairs today?" he asked. "They say the Platform 12 stuff is cursed. The security guy swears tags from that line keep reappearing after he clears them." "Cursed shelves," I said. "That's exactly what this system was missing." He nudged a cardboard box back from the edge with his wrist. "I'm serious. They tell new people not to take that route home. Bad luck. Bad memories. Whatever. Nobody tells me anything," I said. "Which route is supposed to be bad luck?" "The night train that comes in on 12 on Fridays. If something goes wrong anywhere on the line, they shove it onto that platform." The scanner chirped in my hand. A clean, satisfied tone. On the screen, the tag I had just read ticked over from day 089 to day 090. Another suitcase heading for auction. 90 days in limbo, and then you were officially no one's responsibility. That was the part I liked about the job. The system did the hard work. We only followed the rules, moved the carts, kept the timers happy. If something stayed on the shelf, it was because the database had decided to let it live a little longer. The P12 shelves ruined that logic. They sat in the far corner, 3 bays of metal nudged slightly out of alignment with the others, as if someone had pushed them there in a hurry and never bothered to correct it. Most of the tags were yellowed with age, corners curling, tied to luggage that felt too personal to abandon. Children's backpacks with cartoon animals rubbed half away, a winter coat with a scorch mark on one sleeve, a soft toy in a plastic bag with someone's handwriting blurring on the outside. The status lines on the tags said the same thing, over and over: pending review. No auction dates, no purge dates. 5 years of deferment. Kareem slowed his trolley when we drew level with the corner. "See," he said quietly, "Platform 12. Told you, it just means somebody forgot to close the cases." I said, "Paperwork backlog." I did not stop. If you let yourself start investigating every weird corner of the database, you never finished a shift. My contract did not pay extra for curiosity. Then, one of the tags caught my eye. The system print was the standard block text: ID number, origin station, date logged. Underneath, in blue ink that had faded to gray, someone had squeezed in a line by hand in small, careful letters: "Do not dispose. Archive only." I stood still long enough for the countdown on my terminal to drop another minute. We were not supposed to write on tags. If something needed a special status, the code lived in the system, in flags and checkboxes that generated notes like "Do not auction" or "Held for police." Handwriting did not feature in any of the manuals. "Everything okay?" Kareem asked. "Fine," I said, "just checking something." I scanned the tag. The terminal flashed, "Pending review. Created 5 years ago. Last touched 4 years and 11 months ago." No comments. No linked report. No pending task. Whatever the system had been waiting for, it had given up asking a long time ago. "Who wrote this?" Kareem asked. He had stepped close enough now to read over my shoulder. "Probably someone who liked pens," I said. "Come on." We still have 38 minutes before the system starts yelling. I pushed the trolley on. The shelves creaked softly in the wake of the wheels. At the end of the aisle, I turned back, meaning to double-check the tag number and add it to the mental pile of things I would never actually look up. From here, the corner bay looked like every other. Metal, dust, forgotten fabric. Up above, on the metal stairs, a set of footsteps crossed overhead and then stopped directly above the P12 shelves. The sound vibrated down through the frame, a faint ring in the steel. There was no door in that direction at this hour, no reason for anyone to be there. The footsteps did not resume. The countdown on my screen kept sliding downwards, 1 minute at a time. I told myself it was just another shift, just another shelf, and pushed the trolley into the next row. I still thought I was only following procedure. The new case from Platform 12 arrived halfway through the shift. It came down on the small lift from the concourse, alone on its trolley. The porter wheeled it just inside the door, beeped his pass at the sensor, and left before the lift finished closing. The tag on the handle had been printed in a hurry, the laminate still clouded with damp. Origin, Platform 12. Train IC 789. Status, delayed arrival. I clipped my handheld into the dock, scanned the barcode, and waited for the database to do its work. The familiar progress circle spun, then stopped on a message I did not see often. No match. Passenger record incomplete. Underneath, fields stretched out like teeth with gaps. Surname, age range, seat number, carriage, filled. First name, blank. Contact details, blank. Remarks, overflow routing. Kareem leaned in from the next bay. You want me to take that one? He asked. We can split the weirdness. It's just bad data, I said. Someone upstairs will fix it once we log the contents. We opened the bag, described what we found, uploaded photographs, sent the shell into the racks until either the owner appeared or the 90 days ran out. The system was not there to be fixed. It was there to be fed. The case itself was small and old-fashioned, canvas scuffed at the corners, wheels replaced at some point with mismatched plastic ones. When I lifted it onto the bench, it vibrated very slightly in my hands, the way luggage does when a phone inside is ringing on silent. Hear that? Kareem said. Maybe your cursed shelves finally want to call home, or someone forgot to switch off their alarm, I said. We popped the catches. Cold fabric and stale smoke spilled out. Clothes lay folded on one side. Jeans, a sweater, a pair of work trousers, a shirt with the laundry tag still stapled to the label. On top of the pile sat an old smartphone, face down. It buzzed again as I reached for it. A faint insect shiver against the metal tray. The screen came to life without me touching a button, waking not to a home screen but to a single notification. One unsent email draft. Kareem whistled under his breath. Okay, that part is new, he said. Maybe don't open it. Data protection. Right. We have to inventory contents, I said, including electronics. I told myself I was only doing my job as I tapped the notification. The mail client was old, but still recognizable. In the subject line, someone had typed, Platform 12, Incident Report, Draft. The body of the message was short and unfinished, a paragraph that stopped mid-sentence. It mentioned smoke on the platform, an instruction to keep passengers on board, a reference number that meant nothing to me. There was no recipient filled in yet, only a blinking cursor in the to field, waiting for a name that had never been chosen. What does it say? Kareem asked. Nothing complete, I said. It's just a draft. I backed out of the message and checked the connection icon. The phone still had a weak signal. Some part of the network reached even down here. Whoever wrote the draft had been close enough to send it, and had not. Procedure said we were supposed to power down devices and label them, then pass anything with personal data to the secure cabinet. This time my thumb hovered over the options menu for a little too long. Forward. Share. Save. 10 seconds to send now would also be enough. I told myself it was curiosity, not disobedience. That made me tap the forward icon and type my personal address into the empty field. I did not add a message. I only wanted to read the draft again later, somewhere that did not hum and buzz and breathe like part of the station. When I hit send, the phone thought about it for a beat. Then a new window appeared, white and polite. Access denied. Underneath, in smaller text, external forwarding blocked by policy. The header flashed once, then returned me to the unsent draft as if nothing had happened. Kareem had gone back to his own trolley. Nobody was standing over my shoulder, but I felt the mild, involuntary posture shift of someone who knows a camera might be watching. I dropped the phone into the gray plastic tray we used for electronics and closed the case. We still had to list the clothes, the contents of the outer pockets, the stray receipts. In the front pocket, I found a folded ticket stub stamped with a date from 5 winters ago, and the station's logo in a version we no longer used. Tucked behind it was a scrap of local newspaper, torn from a page of small items. The headline was dull and bureaucratic: "Service disruption, under review." A paragraph about minor delays and no injuries reported. Nothing about smoke. Nothing about an incident. Nothing about anyone needing a report. I took photos of everything and attached them to the case file. The database accepted the images, filed them, and left the passenger fields as incomplete as before. When I saved the entry, a thin status bar appeared at the bottom of the handheld, showing the sync with the main system. For a second, an extra line flashed up, a log message most people would never notice. Archive entry, Platform 12, pending review. History, 1 prior related file. I tapped for details. The prior file did not exist anymore. The screen showed a gap where the link should have been, followed by a brief, unembellished line. Deleted by admin KL12. Rain found its way into the station in thin, determined lines. By the time my shift coordinator called me upstairs, the concourse tiles were slick and the air smelled of wet coats and brakes. I preferred the basement. Down there, the system made sense. Carts and shelves and countdowns you could see on a screen. Up here, everything moved too fast. Lost property assist. Merrick, the coordinator, had said on the phone, "Coach transfer mess on the north side. Bring a scanner." North side meant the platforms that handled the longer runs. I clipped the handheld to my belt and followed the signs up through the stairwell. The noise hit first, loudspeakers apologizing, the metallic sigh of a train braking, footsteps on wet floor. Rain drifted sideways through gaps in the roof, shining under the lamps. Platform numbers sat at the end of the hall. 10, 11, 12. The 12 board was grayed out, showing a static message about out of service due to maintenance. It had been like that for months, maybe longer. My actual job was at 9, where a busload of passengers from a canceled regional service had been decanted with their bags and complaints. I helped a couple label their suitcases, logged a stroller into the system, watched a station assistant explain compensation to a man who refused to accept any word short of miracle. When the queue thinned, I had 7 minutes left before I could reasonably claim I was heading back downstairs. The shortest route to the staff stairwell cut past Platform 12. Rain had pooled along the yellow safety line, running in thin streams toward the drains. The platform itself was almost empty. A vending machine hummed under a flickering strip light. Somewhere beyond the curve, a freight train rattled unseen. The camera above the platform sign should have been pointing straight down the line. Instead, someone had turned it slightly away and half covered the lens with black tape. The diode still glowed red. Officially, the system was watching. Unofficially, someone had given it a blind spot. An enamel safety sign clung to the wall beside the stairs. Most of the lettering had rubbed into ghosts, but one line was still legible under the dirt, not for overflow use. Part of the sentence had been scraped away, leaving the words hanging without explanation. I stood just close enough to feel the camera's dead half stare, just far enough that the rain only tapped my shoulders. There was no practical reason to be there. My scanner had nothing to do on an empty platform. At the far end, beyond the bench and the bin, a figure stood behind one of the pillars that held up the roof. I saw only the edge of a dark coat and the angle of a shoulder. Tucked into the slice, the uncovered half of the camera could not see. I took a step closer. The handheld bumped lightly against my hip. "Excuse me," I called. "This platform is closed. You need to move back to 11. My voice sounded small against the open space. The wind off the tracks chewed it and threw it back at me thin. The figure did not answer. The shape of the coat shifted, like someone adjusting their stance. And then the pillar was bare. No footsteps, no door. Just rain marking time on the concrete. My knuckles went white on the scanner handle. Back in the main corridor, I signed out on the terminal and told the coordinator that the coach transfer was under control. She barely looked up from the screen. "Good," she said. "You're clear. Try not to bring the rain back with you," in the service lift. As the doors closed and the world shrank to humming metal, the handheld vibrated in its holster. I took it out, expecting another request on the job queue. Instead, an email notification sat at the top of the tiny screen, marked with the generic icon our internal system gave to anything that didn't fit its categories. Sender: Automated Compliance Monitor. Subject: Access Anomaly Detected. User: E. Nowak. Multiple restricted archive queries detected outside assigned parameters. Please report to Compliance Office by 0900 tomorrow for clarification. I archived the message into a folder I had never had a use for before, and watched the clock on my shift tick another minute down. Somewhere between the platforms and the basement, curiosity had stopped being hypothetical. Someone else cared enough about Platform 12 to let the system speak for them. The lift doors opened onto the basement level. Shelves, carts, countdowns. The scanner felt heavier in my hand than it had a few minutes earlier. The break room always smelled a little like burned coffee and wet wool. The television on the wall was on mute. News rolling through traffic, politics, weather. Lars sat at the corner table, closest to the radiator, with his lunchbox open and a crossword folded beside it. His jacket hung on the back of the chair, sleeves turned up twice. He had been here longer than most supervisors. The station ran on the kind of memory he carried and tried not to share. I poured coffee that had been sitting too long on the hot plate and took the seat opposite him. "You look like someone sent you upstairs without telling you why," Lars said. Still looking at the crossword. "Coach transfer," I said. "It's fine. I just forgot how loud the platforms are in the rain." He marked a box. Chewed. Swallowed. "You'll get used to it," he said, "or you won't. Depends whether you like knowing where the noise comes from." The line hit too close to the email, still sitting in my internal folder. "I was near 12, I said. He put his pen down. "Doing what?" "Walking back to the stairs," I said. It was quicker. The board still grayed out. "There's a sign down there. Old Enamel 1. Not for overflow use." Someone tried to scrape it off, and the camera's half taped. Still on Lars' jaw tightened. A small movement under the loose skin. "Those signs are older than most of us," he said. "Somebody must have missed one when they tidied up." "Maintenance never finishes everything," he said it too quickly, as if from a script. "I also have a new friend," I said. "Internal address. No name. They think KL12 stands for Keep Locked 12. They told me to stop opening what they closed. For a beat, the only sound in the room was the faint hiss of the radiator." Lars reached for his coffee. "Missed the handle. Found it again. Lot of bored people in this place," he said. "Some of them like games." Ignore it, he spoke softly, but the softness felt like cover, not comfort. 5 years ago, I said, what happened in winter? The P12 tags from that window are all pending review. They never went to auction. He looked at me as if weighing how much effort it would take to pretend he hadn't heard. Which winter, he asked. The one that keeps turning up in the files. I said, old logo on the tickets. Newspaper scrap about service disruption under review, and no injuries reported. The tiredness in his face deepened. It was busy, he said. Too many people on the platforms. Not enough staff. Snow where it doesn't usually stick. A timetable that thought it could bully the weather. He pushed his lunchbox aside. Wiped his fingers on a paper napkin. Someone fell under a train, I said. More than one, he said. Not all at once. Little things. Somebody opens a door on the wrong side. Somebody slips where the grit didn't reach. Somebody decides to board when the announcement says stay back. The paper says no serious harm reported. I said, that's the phrasing, he said. I remember it. People don't want grief in their commute. You tell them there was a disruption. You keep it tidy. You get the trains moving again. He glanced toward the door. A phone rang in the corridor outside, sharp against the hum of the vending machine. A second later, the door swung inward and one of the shift supervisors leaned in, holding the handset a little away from her ear. Lars, she said, you're wanted on line 2. North office. Management. Her tone was light, but the look she gave him was not. Lars wiped his hands again, more out of habit than need, and stood. I'll be there, he said. He took one step toward the door and then paused beside my chair. Up close I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. The color gone out of his face. You need this job, he said quietly. Don't make it complicated. He did not wait for an answer. The supervisor stepped back into the corridor with him. The door closing on the start of another conversation pitched just out of earshot. I stared at the half-finished crossword. Some of the clues had been filled in with hard, blocky letters. Others were blank. When I left the break room a few minutes later, the corridor smelled faintly of someone's expensive cologne. The supervisor stood a little way off, talking to a man in a dark suit I had never seen before. He held a slim folder against his chest. They both broke off when they noticed me. For a heartbeat, all three of us were aware of where I had just come from and who I had been talking to afternoon. Marek, the supervisor said. Smile turned up a notch. Busy down there, always, I said. The suited man did not speak. His gaze flicked to the badge on my chest, then to the handheld at my belt, then back to my face. By the time I reached the stairs, their voices had dropped again. I could not make out the words, only the cadence. Report. Reassurance. Capacity. It was the sound of people trying to close an old door without admitting it had ever been open. I had wanted to believe I was still invisible in the system. One staff ID among hundreds, moving bags from shelf to shelf. The brief silence when I stepped into the corridor told me otherwise. I stayed late in the archive. The excuse was a backlog. The reality was quieter than that. The late shift had thinned to the usual skeleton crew. Up in the concourse, the noise would be fading toward last trains and cleaning machines. Down here, the shelves hummed in their own way. Barcodes. Timers. Quiet beeps when somebody somewhere remembered a bag. I signed into the workstation at the end of the P12 aisle. The monitor lit my hands in flat light. The system greeted me with the usual polite lie about how many items were awaiting routine processing. I filtered for Platform 12. The list filled the screen and kept going. Tag numbers. Dates. Vague descriptions of luggage. Most cases in the system had tidy arcs. Logged, held, resolved. Even the ones that ended in auction had a sense of completion. P12 entries looked different. Status, pending review. Review requested by blank. Review outcome, blank. No auction dates. No purge instructions. I set the date filter and tried not to decide in advance what I wanted to see. 5 winters ago. The 2 weeks straddling the date on the old ticket stub from the case with the phone. The list snapped down to a smaller cluster, but not small enough. Tag after tag lit up in the same range. Out of habit, I counted. 9 out of 10 of the P12 items in the system had been logged in those 14 days. Lost coats, travel backpacks, cheap suitcases, a violin case, a high-vis jacket with the rail company logo on the back. All of them held here indefinitely under a status that answered no questions. Procedure said I could treat them as exceptions and leave them to the ghost of some forgotten manager. That was the comfortable answer. Instead, I sent the list to the thermal printer that lived on a shelf under the desk. It woke up with a cough and began to spit out rolls of thin paper covered in tag numbers and dates. The room filled with the faint smell of hot dust. With the printouts laid out on the trolley, the pattern became physical. The dates bunched together like bruises. In the side pocket of a dark blue carry-on, I found another ticket stub. Same origin. Same date as the one from the earlier case. Different seat number. Behind it, folded smaller than it liked, was a scrap of local newspaper with the whole headline still visible this time. No serious harm reported. Someone had underlined the word serious in pencil, hard enough that the point had torn the cheap paper. Kareem took one step back, hands in pockets. I'm not touching P12 again. Last guy who asked too many questions got permanent night shift. For good, he walked off without waiting for an answer. Held up against the list in my other hand. It sounded like a lie told in advance. I photographed the stub and the headline and added the images to the file. The system accepted them with the same neutrality it gave to pictures of umbrellas and forgotten shoes. There was one field on the screen that bothered me more than the others. Review requested by most cases never used it. Sometimes police, sometimes insurance, sometimes a named manager would appear there when an item had to be held back. P12 entries simply sat under, pending review without admitting who had pressed the pause button. I opened the options menu and selected History. For most files, the History tab is dull. Created, updated, moved, closed. On the P12 cases, it looked different. Archive entry, Platform 12, pending review. Auto auction rule, overridden. Reason, underneath. In smaller text, sat lines I had not seen in ordinary work. Auto disposal, suspended by admin KL12. The phrase repeated down the list. I scrolled further back. For the oldest entries, the history did not stop at suspension. There had been notes attached once. The system showed the ghosts of their file names. Incident _P12 _log _01. Incident P12 passenger list. Internal _summary P12 draft. Next to each of them, in the same small type, sat a final action. Deleted by admin KL12. The old machine room sat beyond a door most people ignored. The sign still used a logo the station had replaced years ago, the paint flaking around the edges. Inside, the air was warmer than the corridor, thick with dust and the faint, sweet smell of overheated plastic. Legacy towers hummed in a low, steady chorus along one wall. A bank of terminals slept in different shades of standby. Someone had taped a handwritten note over one of the keyboards. Do not power down. Backup sync. I had a code that worked on most doors in the basement. This one accepted it after a pause, as if reluctant. The lock clicked in a tired way. The terminal woke on the second try. Its fan whined briefly, then settled. The login screen wore an interface that had never quite made it into the modern part of the building. The backup path was not on any menu. You had to know the string. I had found it buried in a procedural PDF that nobody had bothered to delete. Archive. Legacy. Incident_logs. A list of folders slid into view. Most belonged to routine disruptions, weather, strikes, signaling failures. Then another line, bland among the others, P12_winter. I opened it. Inside, the file names were familiar in shape, if not in full. Incident_P12_log_01. Incident_P12_passenger_list. Internal_summary_P12_draft. When I tried to open the first log file, the system stalled, then admitted that the contents had already been overwritten in a later backup cycle. The header remained, along with a single note, not included in final submission. One file resisted the pattern. It sat at the bottom of the directory, small in size, with a name that looked less official. Notes, P12, parenthesis, not for submission, parenthesis. The text inside had been written in the clipped, practical style of someone trying to get thoughts down between phone calls. Overcrowding on 12 again. Staff shortage on platforms. People standing over yellow line. Report of burning smell near rear car. Possible flammable cargo in adjacent track. Not in public summary. One line stopped midway. The cursor frozen years ago. One staff member says someone fell, then was pulled back. Noise on channel. Confusion. Instruction from control. Keep trains moving. At the bottom, in brackets, a note had been added. This part not for submission. There was no signature. The metadata field in the side panel carried the only clue the system was willing to give. Created by Kral. Modified by admin KL12. The name sat there as if it had always belonged in the machinery. The handheld vibrated once at my belt. I took it out. A new internal email waited. From Automated Compliance Monitor. Subject, Access Anomaly Detected. User, E. Nowak. Multiple restricted archive queries detected outside assigned parameters. Please report to Compliance Office by 0900 tomorrow for clarification. I filed the message and logged out. The room felt smaller on the way out, crowded by machines that remembered only what they were allowed to show. On paper and on screens. My surname had started to appear in places that did not belong to my life. My apartment was quiet in the way buildings get when most of their occupants are working early shifts. The neighbor's television was off for once. The pipes had finished complaining for the night. The only sound was the fridge cycling on and off, and when I stopped moving, my own breathing, I dropped my bag by the door and turned on the kitchen light. The bulb hummed and showed me the same chipped mugs and clean sink as every other evening. I made tea without tasting it and carried the mug to the table, where a stack of unopened mail had been slowly accumulating. The legacy printout from the machine room lay folded in my notebook, its edges already softening. I put it down beside the letters and stared at my surname in the small metadata field. Created by Kral. It was not enough. Names repeated. People shared them. In the cupboard above, the fridge sat a cardboard box with a strip of masking tape across the lid. The tape had peeled at one corner. I pulled the box down and set it on the floor. Dust drifted into the light. Inside, the contents were exactly as I had left them after the funeral. Bundled documents. A few photographs. The odd object that had not fit anywhere else. My mother had kept the important files she needed for pensions and accounts. These were the things she had been willing to let me take away. On top lay my father's old staff lanyard. The plastic had gone cloudy with age. The photograph showed a man in his 40s with more hair and less gray than I remembered, wearing a high-vis vest over a station jacket. Under the picture, The name was printed in block capitals. Kral. Joseph. The employer branding was 2 iterations out of date. The color scheme wrong for the current decade. The barcode along the bottom had been punched with a small hole to show it was no longer active. I turned the card over. On the back, in small print, it listed the access areas his role covered: platforms, yards, signal rooms. Incident response. The file in the machine room had not specified a first name. It had not needed to. Beneath the lanyard, a stack of papers sat in a neat, slightly crooked pile, held together with a metal clip. Some were payslips. Some were shift schedules printed on cheap paper. At the bottom was a single sheet covered in my father's handwriting. The date in the corner put it a few months before he left work for good. Dear, the addressee was never filled in. The body of the letter was written in the tone he used when he was trying to be careful: short sentences, fewer jokes than usual. He described a winter in which the platforms had been dangerously full, the pressure to keep trains moving, the way the announcement softened any mention of risk. He wrote about colleagues who had stopped raising their voices because nothing changed. One line had been underlined twice: "If we don't say it, they'll do it again." The pen had dug into the paper on the second pass. The rest of the paragraph trailed off into an unfinished sentence. I folded the letter with shaking hands, realizing for the first time how frightened he had been. I sat back on the kitchen tiles and let the paper rest on my knees. The fridge hummed on. Somewhere above me, someone turned on a tap, water rushing through pipes in the wall. I remembered his cough long before I remembered the details of the winter he was writing about. It had started as a clearing of the throat at the end of long shifts, then settled in as a permanent guest. The doctors had talked about exposure, stress, the way years of breathing in brake dust and cold air stripped away the things that were supposed to protect you. At the time, we had treated his stories from work as noise, background texture to a life that was supposed to keep moving forward. Now the pieces lined up: the winter in his letter, the date on the old ticket stubs, the wording in the news scrap, the notes marked not for submission. He had tried to say something and never found a place to send it. I put the letter back on the table and fetched my notebook. Beside the printed deletion record from the P12 cases, the page held the eviction notice I had taped there months earlier. None of it asked me for a speech. It asked me for a decision. The suitcase sat where we had racked it after intake, the spine of its handle turned toward the aisle, like the curve of a shoulder. If I had not known its tag number by heart, it would have blended into the row of anonymous luggage waiting out their 90 days. The system still called it pending review. I signed in for another late shift and steered my trolley down the P12 aisle. The overhead lights felt a fraction dimmer than in the rest of the room, though I knew that was just the story I had started to tell myself. I took the case down and set it on the metal table. The canvas was cool under my hands. The wheels rattled when I adjusted its position back again. Kareem called from the next row. His voice filtered through shelves and fabric. "Old entry I need to correct," I said. "Paperwork." He accepted that without comment. In a place built on forms and tags, paperwork explained almost anything. The obvious compartments held nothing new. The clothes were as we had logged them, folded, slightly stale, carrying the faint ghost of the person who had worn them. The phone lay in the tray in the secure cabinet, out of reach for now. What we had never done was question the construction of the case itself. I ran my fingers along the lining. One corner gave slightly more than the others. A raised ridge along the base felt less like padding and more like a panel. At the workstation, I borrowed a slim screwdriver from the drawer where we kept spare tag fasteners and battery covers. Back at the table, I worked the tool into the seam where the fabric met the hard base. The panel lifted with a sticky sigh. Dust and a few grains of ballast from some forgotten platform spilled onto the table. In the hollow beneath lay a flat plastic USB stick and a folded sheaf of paper held together with a rusted staple. For a long second I did not touch them. Then procedure made its own argument. If the case contained items, we logged them. That was the rule. I picked up the USB with 2 fingers and dropped it into a small evidence bag from the drawer. The papers I unfolded carefully, smoothing the creases as best I could. The top page carried an internal header. Internal report, Platform 12 incident, draft. The language that followed was less careful than any public statement I had seen. It described an evening of overcrowded platforms, rolling delays, substitution of freight capacity, and a last-minute decision to route flammable cargo through a neighboring track to keep the timetable alive. It listed conflicting instructions, announcements telling passengers to stay back, staff being told to keep boarding to avoid further disruption, control issuing orders that did not match what people on the ground were seeing. Midway through the second page, a paragraph detailed unconfirmed casualty reports from witnesses who had seen someone fall and be retrieved with injuries that would not show up in a statistic labeled minor. In the margin, someone had circled the phrase "no serious harm reported" and written beside it in smaller letters, "not according to staff on 12. Attached behind the report proper was a page of sign-offs. Some were full names, some only initials. They sat beside phrases like reviewed, noted, approved for summary. The USB, when I plugged it into the workstation's front port, contained a digital copy of the same report, along with a longer version that included photographs of the platform afterward. The system recognized the device as external media and politely asked whether I wanted to import, quarantine, or ignore. On the last page of the paper bundle, below the typed paragraphs, a handwritten note had been added. If this stays buried, they will do it again. No signature. No address. The loudspeaker crackled somewhere above the ceiling, the sound traveling down through ventilation ducts and stairwells until it reached the basement as a flattened echo. Due to ongoing disruption, Platform 12 will be brought back into limited service for overflow traffic this weekend. The announcement repeated, slightly distorted the second time. In my hand, the USB felt lighter than it should have. Between the printed pages and the device, I now held more detail about the winter on Platform 12 than any public record had ever admitted. Leaving everything in the false bottom and closing the case would have been the easiest way to keep my job exactly as it was. I slid the report into an internal envelope and wrote only a case number on the front. The USB went into a second bag, labeled with the same number. Above me, the loudspeaker finished its cycle and fell quiet. The shelves around the table stood as they always had, full of other people's unfinished stories. The difference was no longer on the tags. It sat in my hands. The supervisor's office sat just off the admin corridor, tucked behind a frosted glass panel close enough to the concourse to hear the announcements, and far enough that you could pretend they were happening somewhere else. She called me in just before the end of an early shift. The email had been polite and bare, quick catch-up before you go, no subject line, no context. The door clicked shut behind me with the kind of soft finality that never sounded on the open floor. The blinds over the glass were half closed, so anyone passing would see only the outline of 2 people in conversation. Inside, the air smelled of printer, toner, and stale coffee. Her desk faced the door. A monitor sat to one side, a stack of folders to the other. Behind her, a framed evacuation plan showed the station as a series of tidy lines and numbered exits. "Sit down." "Marek," she said, "how are you finding the rota this month?" Her tone was easy, the way people talk before the actual meeting starts. "It's fine," I said. "The late shifts suit me." She nodded as if we had just agreed on something important. Then she turned the monitor slightly, enough that I could see the reflection of the room without making out the text on the screen. "You've been spending a lot of time in the P12 aisle," she said, "and in the legacy machine room. The logs tell us stories before anyone else does. The words were gentle. The content was not, "I've been reconciling discrepancies," I said. "Pending review items without clear owners. Old tags." It looked like a backlog, she smiled. A quick, professional expression. "You're thorough," she said. "We value that. But there are areas where thoroughness isn't part of your remit." On the monitor, a list of access events scrolled by. Timestamps, door IDs, usernames. My own badge number appeared in the column more than once, paired with doors I had used in the last week. Platform 12 was handled on paper years ago, she said. There was an internal review. External inquiries were closed. People have moved on. The station has to move on with them. The archive doesn't look like it moved on, I said. The items are still here. The status is still pending. She tapped one fingernail against the desk. A small, rhythmic sound. Sometimes, she said, the humane thing is to let records go quiet. Reopening certain topics doesn't help the people involved. It just upsets families and feeds headlines. Her phrasing echoed lines I had seen in the old report, softened and repurposed. "What about staff who tried to raise concerns?" I asked. The notes marked not for submission. She looked at me for a long moment. "There was a colleague," she said, eventually. "Not in your department. They pushed too hard on an incident after the fact. Went to the wrong journalist. Bypassed process. It didn't end well for them. They lost their job, their reference, other things they needed." She did not say which other things. She did not need to. In a city where many people's right to stay depended on continuous employment, losing a job was not just a matter of finding another. "I'm not talking to journalists," I said. "I'm trying to understand what we're being asked to look after." She opened a folder, as if this were an appraisal rather than a warning. My name sat at the top of a printed form, surrounded by boxes waiting for ticks. "The system flags patterns," she said. "Multiple accesses to restricted history. Attempts to copy files off legacy machines. Cross-references between old case numbers. Someone always notices." Her pen hovered over the page. "You're good at your job," she said. "I'd hate to see a note about non-cooperation or concerning curiosity appear here. We want you focused on the present. Lost umbrellas, phones, coats, things we can resolve." The envelope containing the P12 report sat in my locker, disguised among lunch wrappers and spare gloves. The USB was in my notebook, which I had left in my bag before coming upstairs. The knowledge of both items sat in the room with us. I could have put them on the desk and watched the temperature change. Instead, I kept my hands in my lap. "If there are formal instructions about what we should or shouldn't open," I said, "I'd like them in writing, so I don't make a mistake." She considered this, then shook her head slightly. "Some things don't go in writing," she said. "They live in judgment, in how we interpret policy. That's why we have supervisors." She signed the appraisal form with a quick flourish. "Take some advice from someone who's been here a long time," she said. "There's a difference between doing your job and trying to rewrite other people's. You need this job. Don't make it complicated." The phrase was almost word for word what Lars had used, but in her mouth it sounded less like concern and more like a boundary. When she stood, the meeting was over. She opened the door herself, so anyone passing would see that I was free to leave. In the corridor, the air felt cooler. I could see my reflection in the dark glass of a locked security room. Fluorescent light on tired eyes. Badge crooked on my chest. At the far end of the hall, a trolley laden with unclaimed luggage waited by the lift, tags fluttering slightly in the air from the vents. One of the suitcases had a small scorch mark on its plastic shell, the kind you only saw if you were looking for it. I straightened my badge and walked toward the lift. The scorch mark caught the light as I passed, a brown bloom on an otherwise ordinary surface. It was the kind of detail you could only ignore for so long. The weekend the announcement had promised arrived with rain sharp enough to cut through umbrellas. The concourse shone with reflections of people and timetables. Every delay elsewhere sent more bodies into the station's tiled bowl. By late afternoon, the screens above the ticket machines had given up pretending everything was fine. Rows of orange text stacked under the word disruption. Each line a train that would arrive late or not at all. Downstairs, our shift coordinator stuck her head into the archive and told me I was needed upstairs for passenger flow. That was the phrase they used when the station started to behave like a container filling faster than planned. Take your handheld, she said. They might need ad hoc tagging if things get messy. On the service stairs, the air grew louder and wetter with each flight. When I stepped out onto the concourse, the sound hit like a wall. Announcements. Rolling suitcases. The low murmur of people calculating whether their journey was still worth it. Platform 12's board was no longer gray. A fresh line of text blinked where the static message had been. P12. Overflow service. Follow staff instructions. The taped camera above the sign still wore its half-blind patch. Near the central information desk, a control kiosk had been set up with extra screens. A member of the operations team scrolled through platform allocations, shunting arrivals and departures into any gaps that appeared. I recognized the interface from training sessions we'd all half listened to. One panel showed a list of platforms with colored bars next to each name. Green for normal, amber for busy, red for approaching capacity. 2 entries carried small warning icons beside them. P12, crowd warning suppressed. P12, safety review flag, dismissed. The labels were plain enough for anyone who wanted to read them. The operator's cursor skipped past and settled on a different field. We don't have a choice, they were saying to someone on a headset. If we don't use 12, we have trains stacked back into the tunnels. Yes, I know what the system says. The signage is updated. Passengers were already being funneled toward the reopened platform. Staff in high-vis jackets held tape lines and gestured, doing their best to keep people behind the yellow stripe. Rain blew in under the edge of the roof, slicking the concrete. From the control room screen, Platform 12 pulsed amber. 124% capacity. The number landed cleanly. Same figure from my father's report. I didn't wait. I moved to the nearest control panel, lifted the clear cover, and hit the emergency override. Speakers screamed the evacuation tone. Side gates rolled open along the concourse, metal teeth parting. The crowd stopped 3 seconds short of crushing. No one fell. No one died again on Platform 12 tonight. The pressure line dipped on the screen. I saw the warning label flash on the panel, the one that had been buried under menus for months. Disabled safety condition, Platform 12. The status changed to active. At the edge of the platform, a child stumbled as the crowd shifted. I grabbed the strap of his backpack and pulled him back into the spill of open space. His mother's face went white, then angry, then grateful, all in the space of a breath. Cameras tracked the movement. Red dots blinked in the corner of the screen. I stepped back as staff took over, my badge already warm against my chest. The evacuation tone cut off. Rain hissed on the tracks. I knew where my face would appear next. The night after the near fall, on Platform 12, the basement felt like a held breath. Most of the building had gone quiet above me. Cleaning machines hummed on the concourse. Somewhere far away, a last train announced itself to people who still believed timetables meant what they said. Down here, the loudest sounds were the fan in the workstation tower and the small tick of the clock next to the fire exit plan. I signed into the terminal at the end of the P12 aisle and set my notebook on the desk. The envelope with the paper report went in front of the keyboard. The USB slid from the pocket with a soft plastic tap. The legal words in the header of the report meant less to me than the photographs and the notes in the margins. I had read them enough times that they lived in my head as much as on paper. If we don't say it, they'll do it again. If this stays buried, they will do it again. There are moments when the system politely pretends you do not have a choice. This was not one of them. I plugged the USB into the front port. The workstation recognized it with the same neutral dialog box as before and offered to import, quarantine or ignore. I closed the prompt and opened the file tree manually. The internal report sat there, unchanged. I copied it into a temporary folder, then opened the old scanner software that lived on the machine like a fossil. The flatbed lid creaked when I lifted it. I laid the paper pages down one by one and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen as the glass dragged light over them. It would have been faster to move only the digital copy, but I wanted both versions aligned. The typed paragraphs, the handwriting in the margins, the note in my father's script. When the last page had turned into a smeared black and white image on the screen, I compressed the files into a single archive and set a password. I pressed enter. The key click sounded final, like a latch closing. On my personal phone, the one the station IT department pretended not to know existed, I opened the webmail for an address I had set up months earlier and never used. A civic group I trusted kept a public inbox for documents people did not know where else to send. The address sat at the bottom of their site in small print, between funding disclosures and a privacy notice. In the subject line, I typed, P12 Internal Report. The body of the message stayed empty for a long time. Then, I wrote a single line. You may already have the headlines. This is the part that stayed off the record. I attached the encrypted archive and typed the password into a separate draft message addressed to myself, set on a delay. When I hit send, there was no dramatic sound. The progress wheel spun, then disappeared. The USB came out of the port and went back into its envelope. I did not trust deletion. I trusted more than one copy in more than one place. I opened the P12 case file from the suitcase with the hidden compartment. The status field still told their bare story. Pending review. Auto auction, overridden. History littered with the line, deleted, by admin KL12. In the action menu, among options to move, close, or annotate, a button waited that we almost never used. Apply legal hold. The cursor hovered. I clicked. A confirmation box appeared in unadorned black text. Legal hold. Do not destroy. The label set itself beside the status line in a new shade of red. Halfway through, tagging the remaining P12 cases from the winter window, my work email chimed. From Compliance Office. Subject, Meeting Invitation. The message thanked me for recent contributions to incident record management and invited me to a discussion about role boundaries and responsibilities. I accepted the invitation. When the last case carried the red tag, I logged out and stood up. The shelves rose on either side, full of other people's almost forgotten lives. A sound came from the far end of the aisle, the faint rattle of a key testing the archive door. The handle moved a fraction, then stopped. I walked down the row until I reached the suitcase with the scorched corner. My hand rested on the burned patch. The plastic was smooth under the damage. On the other side of the door, metal touched metal again. A latch lifted and allowed to fall. A year later, the station ran quieter in small ways most people never noticed. The announcements had changed their phrasing. The floor markings around the platforms had been repainted with thicker lines. A short article lived halfway down a regional news site, sandwiched between transport updates and weather. It mentioned compensation, procedural shortcomings, and a commitment to review safety handling during peak disruption. No names. No apology. Some families received letters and limited payments. Others received silence wrapped in careful language. Platform 12 no longer handled overflow. A new sign stood where the scraped enamel warning had been. Incident Archive, Platform 12. I still worked in the system, Though my badge opened fewer doors, my job title had changed twice without ever settling into something that fit on a business card. One evening, a new hire followed me down the P12 aisle, eyes on the tags. "Why do these stay?" he asked, nodding toward the shelf. "Because they belong to someone," I said. "Even when the system forgets who, I kept a private notebook now. Dates, case numbers, small notes about things that felt wrong before they could be buried." At the end of the shift, I turned off the lights one by one. The room fell into its familiar half-dark. I left a single bulb burning over the P12 aisle. Someone would have to see it every single night shift until they, too, started asking why.